just where I wanna be. And chancing lights and smiles is all you see. So I ain't thinking about the next one. Snapping pics, they be loving my fashion. Great drinks, great friends, and it's flowing well. It's a perfect event. Shout out Riel.
We have Ms. Paula Penn Nabrett, who's an author, speaker, and the president of Penn Nabrett Associates Incorporated. Ms. Celia Williams, who's the institute director at University of Toledo, Human Trafficking and Social Justice Reform. And then we also have Shakira Tyler, who will be joining us in just a moment. And she's a graduate assistant at Michigan State University, and she's really in the green movement right now. And so she's a little bit of, I wanted to get someone who is more new to a movement and participating and seeing how they're looking at the conversation right now, and then people who have already been in the movement. I will give you all a couple moments or a few minutes to introduce yourself. Paula, would you mind starting for us and introducing yourself?
Certainly. Would you like me to do that now?
Yes.
Okay, sure. So I'm Paula Penn Nabrett, and thank you for having me. I think I'm here I don't think you invited me here to speak about my principal business, Penn Nabrett and Associates, even though I'm always happy to talk about that. But we just do demographic research and statistical analysis. That kind of was an odd feeder into the work that I've been doing intensely for the last several years with community gardening and really dealing with the issue of urban food apartheid. So we have a 5,000 square foot garden that is in the rear of a church that is 110, 112 years old. It's a congregation formed by the descendants of formerly enslaved Africans in America. And so my adult children and nieces and nephews are fifth generation in this congregation. And so this space seemed like the perfect place to build this garden. And so we sell the food there for $1 a pound at an on-site farmer's market. So that's kind of the condensed version of why I'm here, I think.
And then Ms. Williamson?
Well, I'm the director of the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute at UT and University of Toledo. I've been doing anti-trafficking work for over 26 years and working directly with victims of trafficking. Of course, disproportionately have been in this part of the country, Black women and youth, and also white Appalachian women. And then around the world, of course, women of color all around the world have been disproportionately affected. So I've done as much as direct service. I actually started in 1993. I went out on the streets myself for 6 months, 3 times a week to learn about the issue myself, because there wasn't anything written that talked about women and youth and their families and how to help them. It was all about HIV and how to prevent HIV from getting to the good populations of the world was my assessment. And
right.
And so the only way to really learn how to help your fellow women and youth was to really go out there with them. And so that's what I did. I learned where all the dope houses were. I learned how the game worked. I learned how trafficking happened. I learned that a lot of the women had started around 14, 15 years old. I moved that work into building the first anti-trafficking program in Ohio. And from there, went back to school and got my PhD and came back and did research for, more than a decade, getting federal dollars to study the issue, formed coalitions, state commissions. Now the Institute and where we do research and community organizing. And then I recently started a podcast and a global network where people can come in, advocates who are passionate but don't know a lot about how to be effective in the anti-trafficking work, can come in, connect with people who are experts in the field from all around the world. They can hear live speakers, take courses and workshops and connect. And so all of those things are just my way of saying I've done all the academic stuff. I've done the publications and the grants and the tenure and all that rigmarole that you do. And the rest of my career is doing the work and making the difference, and not chasing whatever it is that a university tells me to chase, but chasing, I answer to a higher ethic and a higher power than that. So that's the rest of my career, is making the difference.
I like that. And then Shakira, can you just introduce yourself and?
Okay. Hi, peace, everyone. I'm Shakira Tyler. It's great to see so many beautiful people, and I missed some of the bios, so I hope our discussion can share what I missed. So I serve many hats. I'm a farmer, seed keeper, and community organizer, educator, mother. I just recently graduated from Michigan State University with my PhD in community sustainability. And I study Black agrarianism and food sovereignty movements, food justice movements, as it relates to Black liberation and the Black freedom struggle broadly throughout the African diaspora. And I work with Black farmers mainly here in Detroit, also in the Mid-Atlantic and the Deep South. And I serve on the board of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. That's a Black-led organization. We have D-Town Farm, that's on the west side of the city, 7 Acre Farm, the largest urban farm in the state of Michigan, where we facilitate basically the reconnection of people reconnecting to the natural environment and our food system by growing food, getting our hands dirty, becoming more acquainted with the natural environment around us. And we see that as a core part of how we conceptualize community self-determination and creating self-reliant, self-autonomous, and self-governing Black communities through food and land. So I'll end there. I'm not sure how long the bios are supposed to be, but I'll stop.
That's perfect. And so as you see, we kind of have two different topics going on within this panel. My hope is to talk about how are we defining the questions or problem solving. So my first question actually is coming off of what Ms. Williamson brought up, is being on the ground, being in there. Like, you can study a lot, but what is the importance of being on the ground and being in the community that you hope to support?
To me, it was life-changing, because there comes a time where you can't trust what you read in the literature, because for hundreds of years, knowledge has been received from who? From white men. And I don't have a problem with white men, but it's just one perspective. And white men, their research subjects were other white men in universities. So then knowledge came out as objective knowledge, but really it was just one perspective. And so when you want to know what the perspective is and how other people understand their world and experience their world, you have to go out there and you have to ask them how they experience their world. You can't necessarily go to the literature and then try to generalize it to that population. And so for my population, there was no other way.
Yeah. What about for you all? How important is it to be in the community that you're hoping to serve? So whether it's for food security and whatnot, but like, how important is it to actually know that community?
Well, the issue of community has, I think that there's clearly an issue of intersectionality here. I think for me, the work with the actual garden, and we don't have a farm, it's only 5,000 square feet, but that work is happening in the space of community. I think that now that I'm 65, my view about community is very different than it was when I was 45, and certainly than when I was 25. And so sort of circling back to the issue of this gap between what happens in the academy and what happens in the community. And recognizing that even coming of age in the 70s, and very much engaged in the whole womanist issue, and that acknowledgement, and yet simultaneously observing how quickly we discount the wisdom of older Black women. I mean, we, even as we're pouring out libation to the ancestors of the continent, we bypass the elders within our own community. And I was certainly doing that. And I recognized when my husband died, and we'd been married for 36 years, 8 months, and 22 days. I realized that we had had this marriage and raised these 3 children. We've always been self-employed. We homeschooled our kids until they went to college. But all of that was happening in the context of this congregational community. And I began noticing that so many of these women who are in their 90s have a level of vibrancy that is astonishing. And I think it's because of community, which is something that I didn't understand when I was going to prep school, when I was going to Wellesley, when I was going to law school. I was just sort of getting the paper, right? You just get the paper, you go get the next paper. Doing the writing, getting the books published, doing the publications. And all along, there's this community back here, right? This community that's multi-generational. So that when someone stops me at church and says, "Oh, you look just like Hattie." Hattie was my great grandmother who was at Bluefield State Teachers College in 1898. And she lived until I was 11. So it's not like I didn't know. I mean, I knew her well, but I'm still in community with other women who knew her well. And I think that this correlates to this issue about food and the fact that if you're looking even broadly at that Judaic-Christian tradition, he started us in a garden for a reason. Everything that we need is here in this earth. And we've been increasingly so alienated. So again, going back to this whole idea of what is it that we're chasing? And how do we help other people think about, Shakira, when you mentioned you're a wife, you're a mother, you're a scholar, you're a community organizer. I think that kind of 3-dimensional life is something that is very much part of our tradition, but I think a lot of us have been increasingly disconnected from that. So part of what I see in terms of being in the community is helping to be a connector to those pieces, right? That to me is the food, selling the food for $1 a pound, that's critical. And addressing urban food apartheid, that's critical. But a lot of that work has been done by Caucasian white people in our communities. And I think it's critical for us to reclaim that. And again, going back to your point, I don't have anything against white people. I mean, I really don't. It's not an anti-white thing. It's just that in our space, in our community, like the reason that we decided to homeschool our kids and we hired African and African-American graduate students at Ohio State to teach math, biology, French. It's not that we hate white people. We wanted an alternative universe for our children where they would be surrounded by adult versions of themselves. And that's the kind of privilege that typically white people have and take for granted. But very few of our children have the experience of being taught and nurtured holistically, exclusively by adult versions of themselves. So I see this feeding thing all connected.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the idea of challenging how we think about community and not letting it be just one-dimensional, but also looking at also who's in that space and making sure that it's intergenerational as well, that you are able to pull that knowledge and experience. I think a lot of times, even last week, we were talking about child abuse, domestic abuse, and we talked about things that we saw in other generations of men finding young women at high school who they thought are cute and buying things for them, and people not saying this is abuse, but now that we have more time, we've thought about it and we've like there's more conversations. Like you have other generations talking about like this is abuse and using the language around it and stuff like that. Before I keep going further, I would like to see if Shakira had any comments about the importance of community or how we are defining community that for the places we're trying to serve.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I can add. So I'll start by saying that being in academia makes it really hard to be yourself, especially as a Black woman. And through my academic research, my academic research actually led me to grassroots communities because I had so many unanswered questions that the literature and my professors at the time couldn't answer. And as I was doing research interviews for my master's thesis with Black farmers in the countryside of Michigan, they would often say, well, what are you going to do with this work? Well, what are you going to do with this information? Is this just a diagnostic? We know what the issues are. We know racism exists. We know that colonialism exists. And so what are you doing to transform my reality as a Black farmer that's struggling to keep my land, to sell my products, just to survive? And I think that was a major shifting point. One of the major shifting points for me to expand beyond what we call the paralysis of the diagnosis. You know, like we just get stuck to diagnosing the problems, and we don't focus more on the solutions. And in my experience, the solutions are coming from the people in the community actually doing the work, actually getting their hands dirty, actually causing their bodies to be sore from doing the work, not just sitting at a computer, reading, writing, and teaching about the theories that everyday people have to live with and struggle with. And so I think that was a huge part of my awakening as a scholar activist and a community organizer, and understanding that in order for me to be fully human, I have to embed myself in the community, because that's when I feel most alive. That's when I feel most connected to the creator. And ironically so, I feel most connected and most alive when I'm on working with land, when I'm cooking with people, when I'm engaging with community in the context of the natural environment. When we're working the soil, we're digging for worms, we're studying the stars, you know, we're sharing recipes and seeds. And so food and land and community go hand in hand. And I think that's really been my salvation as an academic that was drowning in a lot of unuseful theories and just really ridiculous, a really toxic environment that wasn't conducive to my healthy body, mind, and spirit.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. Like, I think the conversation between people who are in the force doing work, and academia has to be stronger. I went to Wellesley. My mom went to MIT. She has a tutoring service. So growing up, like these Ivy League schools were very like, you know, kind of like, oh, you're going to go to Ivy League school is the dream, and then going into those spaces and realizing that they're missing such huge parts of the conversation. And like my lived experience has taught me a lot of things that like is not being talked about, or the fact that a lot of things that they're discussing are theories. And I'm like, this is real life for me. Like what you're talking about it's not a theory. Like micro businesses, small businesses, or whatever aspect, like international relations and sociology, and like whatever aspect of this conversation is real for somebody. And sometimes like it's so removed, it's so like this theory and this person and whatever decided this thought, and we should just keep building on that. And it's like, that's great to think about different lessons we learned from the past, but it's also great to talk, you know, to people who are doing things. So having that conversation in real time is important. And I feel like both of you all were kind of saying that of like, Celia, from having that experience before and then deciding, hey, I think it's time for me to actually get out there. I am interested in hearing a little bit more about your experience from moving from academia into like hands-on experience, and what's that shift been like for you?
I think I started hands-on then academia.
Okay.
But I think I want to honor what they're saying about community because it's so important for me as well. Because I wrote a book called Seat at the Table, The Courage to Care About Victims. And the seat at the table is important to me because the first seat at your table is the seat at your family's table. And that's where you come, I'm convinced that's where you learn a lot of your first values around food and at the table. And at my table, was my mom, my sisters, the neighbors, cousins. Everybody came to my mom's table like every morning to eat breakfast, have coffee, whatever my mom's place was, the spot, like in the neighborhood. And and I couldn't sit at the table. I had to sit like outside the table when I was little because people of honor sat at that table.
Mm-hmm.
And you learned through the stories. Unfortunately for women, I learned that they were abused and mistreated. And I really thought I thought that was a rite of passage for a woman. You are mistreated, violence, rape, and you survive those experiences. And that makes you a strong woman. And that's, of course, not what the lesson you should take away, but so many women, particularly women of color, experience so much disrespect and violence in their lives that the people around you can experience that as, oh, this is normal. And so that's why, if I go out on the streets for 6 months, I'm not scared. I went into crack houses. I'm not scared because, that was like, and it was Tuesday. It wasn't anything special. So I think that, but the values that you take away from the table are, these people are valuable no matter what their background, their socioeconomic status, no matter what you have or what you don't have. It's about how you treat people. Those are the values you learn from your family and you take away from the table to then have seats at other tables as you go through your life and careers and influence people at other tables that can open doors for you. But it's that first table where you have community, where you really learn important values and lessons.
Yeah. What you just said kind of reminded me of two things. First, sitting at the kids' table, I was like the youngest in my family. So I'm always at the kids' table, not the adults' table, wanting to know what they were saying. But also growing up and into my adulthood, after having a lot of therapy and identifying like red flags and things, realizing like a lot of things I heard about around dating was actually toxic and abusive, relationships. And it shouldn't be normalized, but it's having that conversation and which kind of brings me back a little bit to the food conversation too. About a year ago, I was talking to a friend, and he was telling me how he was really excited because he spent a few weeks with his cousin, and he called her like the rich cousin. He's like, yeah, she cooks 3 times a day. Like usually I'm lucky if I have 1 meal a day. And I'm thinking, we're like mid late 20s, you know what I mean? Like it was kind of hard for me to gauge that, like, for this person that wasn't normal, and like to have the 3 meals a day, but also that like I wasn't aware of the fact that my friend or somebody even in my circle was in a place where they didn't have that or didn't have food or. Paula, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I was listening to both of those things and thinking that, again, that the issue of intersectionality of how we bring elements of the community together, I think that one of the challenges is when people enter the academy, and I was really taken, Shakira, with what you were saying about being in the academy and how toxic those spaces can be. And I think that frequently we've seen phases where all the focus has been getting into the academy and getting into the right institution and getting the degree, getting the terminal degree, without really doing a lot of analysis about what is the cost and how do we balance that, right? And so one of the things that is important to me is, yeah, the Black church has tons and tons of issues and challenges. But one of the amazing things, I mean, my late husband and I both come from families that have been in this country since the late 1700s. So both of us come from families that have been involved in lifelong marriages for as long as it's been legal for Black people to do that, and pursuing post-secondary education for as long as it's been legal for Black people to do that. So just like my great-grandmother was at Bluefield State Teachers College in 1898, my husband's grandfather was at Morehouse in 1898. This whole idea of coming together and the table. So the table, whether that's the table of communion at church or the table of foot washing in church or the table of your own multi-generational family. So, my siblings, my adults, brothers and sisters and their spouses, we all still have dinner with my parents every Sunday. And my father is dead now, but we're now in the fourth generation.
Wow.
We all go to the same church. We get on each other's nerves. Okay, right to that. Church frequently gets on my nerves. Okay, frequently. I'm like, dude, today, why would we wrap it up? But the reality is, the nurturing and love that my children received in the Black church has not been duplicated anyplace else. So yeah, I was glad we homeschooled them. The twins went to Princeton. The baby, I've got to stop saying baby. My youngest is 37 years old. He went to Amherst. My kids have been to space camp, oceanography camp, engineering camp. All that enrichment stuff is all good. But the community thing of where do we come together and eat? Like the Sunday school picnic, that's where you come and hear all of these stories and all of these lessons. And this is where people come and bind up these wounds, right? This is where the older sisters take you aside and say, baby, this is not what God has for you. Okay. This is when the brothers take the other brother aside and say, you know what, you're going to have to be sat down because of the way in which you've engaged this woman. You're going to be silenced in the church, because this is how we are going to engage each other in community. And so I think the challenge is, frequently, as many of us have gotten, as old people say, a little piece of education, not a whole lot, a little piece of education. And we don't just move out of Black neighborhoods. We don't just stop going to Black schools. We don't just disconnect from our poor Black relatives who don't know how to act in public. We stop going to Black church, right? Because it's a whole different way of being in the world. Right? It's a whole different way of being in the world. But that kind of feeding of community within community is something that I think has to be explored critically, yes. But we can't just kind of move away from that and move into the toxicness of the academy, critique how toxic the academy is, and yet be loath to come back into community and get our hands dirty.
Yeah.
I just think I see that conflict as really significant.
Definitely. Before I pivot, I wanted to give Shakira an opportunity to join in. And if you don't have anything to add to, it's fine too.
So I'll say I agree with what has already been said, and I also want to emphasize how church can be had in other spaces. Church is sort of a political, cultural, social site, right? And so within the Black land or farming spaces, the land is church for many of us. And we gather on the land to worship. It's a form of worship to plant a seed, to cultivate it, harvest it, return it back to the soil. And so that's a worshiping process, where we can honor their creator. And I totally agree about the tables and the family and these places of worship being the primordial sites where our children are being instilled with our traditional values or our cultural values. not to say that Black cultural values are like a monolith, but you know, we we gather at these sort of so-called invisible sites, like in the family home, in the backyard, I mean, wherever we feel connected, to build community, to learn with one another, to tell stories. And I think that's really the sacredness. That sacredness is really important, and that
Yeah.
reminds me of the need to talk about spirituality and like the place that spirituality has in community, and how spirituality is very void in academia.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could. I won't go off on a tangent.
I think what
I want to say, Mia, I wanted to say one thing that that really Shakira's comment triggered. There's a organization, the Black Church Food Security Network, that Reverend Dr. Heber Brown is really instrumental in. And for folks who are not familiar with that, it really does tap into this whole idea that church is not just church in the Judaic-Christian tradition of a space that everybody goes to, but that this whole idea of how we are connected to one another and how we provide love and support. And some of that comes through food and through the planting and the harvesting of food, is really a very valuable thing. And again, part of one of our hashtags at our own garden is he started us in a garden for a reason. What the human family needs is in this space, and it's nurtured in that space.
Yeah. I think y'all brought up something very interesting around spirituality and the land. And I know Paula one time brought up to me something that was a completely new concept around like having Black people having like PTSD around like farming. And I also have thought about it in a sense of like sexual abuse survivors in the past. Like that's how I've learned more so PTSD in current context, and how I don't know if you all, you know, Celia, if you have any experience of thinking about PTSD with people who were trafficked or sex abuse survivors, or if you all have any idea about the thoughts about PTSD and why we would have that around farming as Black people.
Well,
I can't speak of farming, but you know, trauma and PTSD and trauma informed care and all those things, that's what we're all about every day, all the time, because every single one of our victims and survivors have, you know, PTSD, have symptoms around PTSD, and we do a lot of training around providing trauma informed care and those types of things, and sending people to specifically trained trauma treatment therapists.
What does trauma look like? Because I think we tend to think about PTSD with combat veterans or whatnot, but we don't think about it with everyday people. So in your area of expertise, what does that look like, generally speaking?
Trauma looks like, from the victim who is experienced trauma, it can look like non-compliance. It can look like people going off at you, and then people are restrained or people are punished in some way, but all they're doing is reacting to trauma, to a traumatic experience. They don't trust you, and they have good reason, because there's been people who look just like you or wearing the same outfit you wearing or the same uniform you wearing that has done things to them in the past. So actually, responses to trauma are very logical if you understand that that person is suffering trauma. And if you're trained to recognize, to understand and recognize, then you can provide a trauma-informed response, which doesn't further traumatize your victim. So for instance, in my case, you know, if you have a woman that is in a substance abuse treatment program or whatever, but has been trafficked, raped, abused, sold, and they have a visitor, and the nurse comes in to tell you that, but the nurse stands in front of the door and says, well, wait, I just want to make sure you're safe. Well, the nurse has a good reason. They have good intentions. But what the nurse is doing is actually blocking the door. That's very trauma provoking to somebody that has been held by a trafficker, or that has been raped in the night repeatedly by someone who came in their room and controlled that situation. So trauma-informed care can be anywhere from a cop or anybody using the wrong language to describe your experience or describe you, or it can be somebody with very good intentions that are just trying to protect you, but actually triggers a re-traumatizing response. And so now we're trying to get, we're training criminal justice, healthcare, social services to provide a trauma-informed care response, so that they at least do no harm.
Right.
I mean, even if you don't know how to be therapeutic, you will at least do no harm and re-traumatize your victim. But trauma it can look very scary. It can look very non-compliant. It can look very non-pleasing to people who think that you should just be grateful for what I'm trying to do for you. So yeah, it's really about helping the person survive and thrive, and not about how much they can kiss your behind to make you feel better about the good thing you're doing for them, you know?
Right.
So, yeah.
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 The conversation that I had with you earlier, Riel, was about some of the research that we've been looking at in post-traumatic slave syndrome. And we sort of came to that indirectly. Again, in my real work, the work that I do with organizational development is hinged on demographic research and statistical analysis. And so through that work, we were exposed to some of the research on the impacts of trauma on second and third generation descendants of Holocaust survivors. And I was intrigued by that because the focus was not on Holocaust survivors, but on DNA markers of stress on second and third generation descendants of Holocaust survivors. And that then made me think, the Holocaust really began with what? Hitler's election to chancellor, and it ends V-Day. So that's 20 years. That's roughly one generation. And yet the impact of domestic terrorism, not combat, because you're right about, usually we think about PTSD with combat. These were not enemy combatants. These were people who were former neighbors who then engage in this really systemic, institutionalized domestic terrorism. And the human psyche's ability to try to understand why is this happening is so fraught that we see DNA markers of stress in second and third generation descendants. And so then I began asking, what could we extrapolate from that research for people who are the descendants of individuals who have survived kidnapping, the Middle Passage, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, continued militarized policing. So that when I talk about this location of our garden on the grounds of this church, that's the home of a congregation of people who are the descendants of Africans who had been enslaved. So that when I talk about my great grandmother, Hattie, and her friends, these are people who their parents had been enslaved. And so yes, you can see the external markers. So like you see the successes, right? So yes, this person is the child of people who were enslaved, and she decides as an unambiguously Black woman. I mean, I look just like my great grandmother. So there's no good hair, light eyes, not unambiguously Black people. And this blackety black, Pentecostal, apostolic, loud. Are we ever going to get out of here, church?
A 4-hour service church.
Are we ever going? Is it going to end? Is it going to end? But so part of what trauma looks like in communities like this, not in educated communities necessarily, but in communities like this, what it looks like is when we began building this space to grow this food, the number of people in the community who said, why are you doing that? Because baby, I know you went to school. Why are your sons out here doing this? Baby, I know they went to good schools.
Mhm.
They went to good schools, and we're so proud of them. We're so proud of them. Why are they out here doing this? I went to school so I wouldn't have to do this. And I think some of doing this is because people are not seeing what Shakira just pointed out, which is communing with the land is a form of worship,
Yeah.
right? It's a form of worship. But when we take on the ideology of the oppressor, it's a parallel to what we frequently see with women, right? Like when
How
I
so?
decided to stay at home, when I decided to have my twins while I was in law school, the majority of people who gave me pushback about that were not men, they were women.
Mm.
It was women who
Mm.
said to me,
And they tell you what men would say to them, or
I
they
can't
feel like
believe
the world would tell them.
you're obviously not serious. Because if you were serious, you wouldn't have had twins while you were in law school. And when I decided to stay at home for a year, you clearly are not serious. If you were serious, you would be out here doing that corporate thing. This thing of modeling the oppressor and the oppressor's ideology while simultaneously complaining about patriarchy. It's like when women say things like, I can't work for a woman. You know how women are. All my best friends have always been guys. I don't know, maybe other women were jealous of me.
Right.
Have you ever heard a man say, I can't work for a man?
Right.
They might say, I can't work for that man.
Right.
They don't make it a collective because they know they okay. And so
Yeah.
this whole thing of how we often see women denigrating women's work. So when I do workshops on not just how to grow food, but how to can it, how to preserve it, because if growing your own food is like printing your own money, then preserving it is a savings plan.
Oh, I like that. I like that.
But when I have workshops on how do you make your own tomato sauce, how do you make your own pickles, how do you make your own strawberry jam, people are like, girl, shoot, I ain't got you. We all have the same 24 hours. So don't say I don't have time for that. Say I don't consider this to be worthy of my time.
Yeah.
Right. So that mindfulness that Shakira talked about, like one of my dearest friends is a sister, Liana Asim, and about 20 years ago, she mentioned to me, I don't worry that much about whether or not I'm gonna bless the food at the table. As I'm preparing the food for my family, I'm praying over it. Bless this
Mm.
flour, bless this yeast, bless these greens, bless this as I'm preparing it. That mindfulness of the task. No, that's not something I learned at Wellesley. I didn't learn that in prep school. I certainly didn't learn that in law school. But those are very meaningful kinds of ways of not only healing the self, right?
Yeah.
But because again, when I look at these old Black women and I wonder, how are you bouncing around here looking like that,
Mm.
talking like that, expressing such joy? How are you able? Because I don't have to have all the details, but I know some bad stuff has happened in your lifetime.
Right.
You've been here
So where
on
do
the,
you get all this joy? Like, where
you've
did it
been
come?
here as a Black woman dealing with patriarchy and systems of white supremacy for 90 plus years. I don't need to know the details.
Mm-hmm.
I need to know how you've managed to navigate that and maintain joy.
Yeah.
That's what I need to know.
And now we have about 5 minutes left. This is first. I want to say this has been an amazing conversation. I feel like I had a short list, but a list of questions beforehand, and this has got like places I didn't expect. So I'm very happy for that. Um, I feel like I wanted to do kind of two things. Has COVID impacted your space at all? Like I will say, I've and this shocked me. I've heard stories about people in the city of Detroit. I'm right outside of Detroit, in Troy, Birmingham, but people in the city of Detroit saying that they don't have fresh food where they are, or they're going to the marketplace. But I know, like, grown in Detroit, I know all these Black farmers are here, and I'm kind of shocked. I'm like, if any place in this world, oh, should have some access to to food from Black farmers, I would think it would be here. But then on the other hand, I've also read stories and talked to social workers, and they said domestic abuse has been up 800% in some areas, and not just like, that's not just Black, that's just across the board because of COVID and as people being at home with their abusers. Have y'all experienced any change to what you're doing? It can even be like less people have time to help. How has that looked for you all?
Well, I know for our population, we have to do a lot of phone calls. We have to organize, do round robin calls. We have to make sure that our organizations will connect somebody with what they need. We have been talking a lot to the sheriff's office, and they've been looking for runaways and getting families into, because being a runaway is one of the highest risk factors for trafficking. So getting them in safe shelter, getting them good wraparound services, and understanding, how to talk to women, particularly in houses with code words, and understanding that people might be in listening shot when you're calling to say, is everything okay? And just trying to provide services in ways that are different. And I think for my community, particularly in Toledo, it's been going as best as possible. Although now that women have different needs, we see more landlords taking more sexual advantages in exchange for rent, those types of things, because they know the women can't be put out. They know that they wouldn't have a safe place to go. And so it's just the risks are higher, and the risks are also the same, domestic violence and those types of things, but also different in terms of how people are able to take advantage of vulnerable people and exploit them in different ways.
Yeah.
But I have to say, just talking to Shakira, just being on here with Paula and Shakira, I want to go out and make a garden, and all I was interested in doing before was drive to the grocery store and get some. But y'all have really convinced me that this is an important investment in time. And so as soon as I get off here, I'm getting ready to go get my daughter and say, guess what we're going to try to do?
Yes.
We don't even know what we're doing. But now I see the value and the importance of it. So I think it's therapeutic. It's therapeutic for the work I do. And I can now see the value in that, because I think as with COVID, self-care is very, very important. And so just the way you guys have described that and the importance of it just takes me back to family and community and the fun I used to have.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, yeah, maybe we need to do some of that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue, actually, because the next panel we have, or just the next session we have, will be a check-in, where it's all about our mental health and kind of grounding ourselves. I definitely hope you all will join us again in the future. Perhaps, Ms. Williamson, we can have you separate so we can talk more about signs, things that we can do, and dig a little bit deeper. But from the start of our summit, it seems like these are conversations we'll continue to have throughout the year. So I hope to talk to you all again about these things.
Thank you.
And what we could do in the future to try to reduce it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So everybody, we're going to hop back to the stage. And so I will see you all there in a little bit.